Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Before I kick this video off, I just want to say thank you to everybody that left a comment on my review video that I posted the other day for the brand new Honda CRF 450L. If you did not see that review video yet, look down in the description. I'll make sure that there's a link to it. And I also got tons of private messages from folks as well, in addition to the comments. I posted a link to the video on Reddit in the Dual Sport forum, on Thumper Talk, and on ADV Rider, and I think I have private messages from folks in probably all of those different places. And the most frequent question I got was, why did I choose this bike over one of the Austrian bikes or over bike XYZ? And I had mentioned the maintenance intervals were part of it, and a lot of folks represented, hey, the maintenance intervals are pretty much the same on orange. So, why go with Honda? The price point also very similar. And there's a couple other reasons why. I know, well, I shouldn't say I know. I've not personally ridden one of the KTMs, but from folks that have ridden them and tried to put a lot of street time on them, from what I understand, they're just not a really smooth bike on the highway. And, I could see that. I know Honda went to a lot of trouble to try and, tame down the buzziness of the bike, and you can still feel it just a little bit. It's not something that's annoying, but coming from a WR where you don't feel any of that at all, you can tell it's there, but it's not annoying. Have not personally ridden one of the KTMs, but from what I understand, it is certainly an issue on those bikes. And same thing with the Husqvarnas and the Betas. So, all right, I'm going to bring this up. This is going to look like a bit of an eye chart, and I want to talk a little bit about what I've done here. So, actually, on Reddit, one of the questions that I had asked in my own thread that I started was, hey, did anyone actually ever do a comparison of the maintenance intervals on all these modern bikes? And I couldn't find one. I'm not suggesting I'm the first person to put together a table that looks like this, but even if there is one out there, I doubt it's up to date with all of the newer models and specs for these bikes. All the bikes on here, and I made a note down here at the bottom, but this is accurate as of whatever bike is currently released. So either the 2018 or the 2019 model, depending on the make and model. But whatever the current most available one is. So I focus mostly on maintenance intervals on this chart. So I've got oil change, spark plug, and this is, to be clear, this is spark plug replacement, valve check, valve replacement, and replacing the piston and the piston rings. I also tracked a couple what I would consider to be just key specs. The wet weight, and I know there's going to be some controversy around this one. I'll come back to it. The number of gears the bike has, the fuel capacity in gallons, the seat height in inches, the ground clearance in inches, and the MSRP in US dollars. So let me go back to wet weight a second. A lot of manufacturers are publishing fair and honest wet weights for their bikes. I know Honda published a wet weight of 289 for the CRF 450L. I didn't weigh mine. I'm going to take them on their word. I'm sure someone will weigh their bike, but it's probably within a pound or two of this, as are, I think, most of these numbers from the manufacturers. However, that said, and I'm sure you know this, a lot of these bikes, the manufacturers only list the dry weights. So where did I get these numbers? In the case of KTM, for example, that only lists the dry weight for their bikes, what I did was I got the service manuals for each one of these bikes, and actually it's the same, I think, for all three of these. And I looked at the fluid capacities. All the different fluids in the bike. So if there's coolant in the bike, if there's oil in the bike, if there is gas in the bike, well, obviously we're going to count. So wet weight gassed up, which is what most of the wet weight figures from the manufacturer are. I looked up how much all those fluids weigh. So how much does a gallon of gas weigh? How much does a quart of oil weigh? How much does a quart of coolant weigh? I think I added maybe, I don't know, half a pound on for brake fluid as just a general figure. But these are calculated. The wet weights are calculated based on the sum total of all the fluids that would go into the bike. And for any of the ones that I did that where the wet weight is a calculation, I actually just kind of Googled the wet weight for the bike to see if anybody had weighed theirs, and I did find probably about 50% of them, and in every single case I was within 2 pounds of what they said their bike actually weighed on a scale to my calculated figure. So I think all these are really pretty darn close. I'm sure we'd find a couple differences if we took every single one of these bikes straight from the manufacturer, filled the gas tank to the rim and popped it on a scale, but I bet you they're all within, say, 3 pounds of the truth, which I think is pretty darn close. So again, I know I already said it that this is a bit of an eye chart, but I have another tab here where I can compare just any three at once, and it makes it a lot easier to view. But before I do that, another thing I want to mention, KTM is another example of this, and I think the same was true for Husqvarna and Beta as well. They don't give their maintenance intervals in miles. They give them in hours. And this is another, I know, potential point of controversy, but what I did to get these to compare all of these in miles is I took a figure of 35 miles traveled, equaling 1 hour of operation time. I chose 35 miles because I think that is a pretty fair average speed of someone that is taking one of these bikes, gearing up, riding to the trail from their house, riding on the trail, mix of, maybe some faster double track to, some slow single track, and then riding home in that bike, including maybe some idling time, sitting around, whatever. Depending on how you ride, that figure might not be accurate. If you truck your bike to the trail and you do a lot of single track and your average speed is, maybe more like 15 to 18 miles per hour. If you only ride your bike on the street, or you ride, an hour to the trail, and then, you do maybe an hour or two of trail riding and then an hour back to your house, this figure is probably going to be a bit higher. But I think 35 miles is a good, just kind of general figure for a bike that is going to be ridden on both the street and the trail. Let's say roughly, I don't know, maybe 70-30, 70 street, 30 trail. So anyway, all right, that's out of the way. Let's skip to compare any three. So I'm going to pick the bikes here that I think make the most sense for me, or the bikes that I really sort of had in my mind when I was making this purchase. So let me bring up my WR250R first. That is, I still own that bike, although that bike is going to be going to my good buddy Tom. Bike I just purchased, Honda CRF 450L, and probably the biggest contender to that bike that I had seriously considered in the past and not pulled the trigger on, but would be the 500D XCF from KTM. And looking at this, you can see the WR 250R really wins out on oil change and all these figures, and they don't even actually list a suggested time to replace the valves or to replace the piston and the piston rings. And there's stories out there with folks that have over 100,000 miles on these bikes, and having just done a couple valve checks, never replacing the valves, and never doing a piston or rings. I mean, these are a lot of these 250 class bikes are kind of overbuilt, detuned, and they get these crazy maintenance numbers due to that. That said, I don't know that I'd really wait 26,600 miles to check the valves. I think I have about 5,000 on my WR250R, and I've not checked the valves yet, but I was planning on doing it at around 10,000 miles. And I think any bike, regardless of what the maintenance intervals or suggested checks are, I don't think I'd go more than 10,000 miles without checking the valves. It's not that difficult to do, and the reality is a lot can happen in 10,000 miles of riding. And I think something else to talk about too with oil changes. So I'd have no problem waiting 3,000 miles on my WR to change the oil if I did mostly street riding, which I think is what a lot of these manufacturers think about, or that's the figure that they have in mind when they write these maintenance tables. And in fact, many of the maintenance tables actually say right on there, these intervals apply to street riding only. The maintenance should be performed more frequently for off-road riding. So something to think about. And flipping back to this here, I think that you should take that into consideration when looking at some of the really high outliers. Like a CRF 250L, I know, same thing as the WR. That motor it's built like a tank, and it's detuned. I might go this long on the street. I probably wouldn't. I'd probably change it at like 5,000 if I own one of these tops, but in no way would I wait 8,000 miles to change the oil on this bike. I don't think I'd wait 8,000 miles to change the oil in, or I should say 7,500 in a KLX 250 or 6,000 in a KLR 650 if I was riding these bikes on the trail. And I'll tell you why. On the trail, not only do you have the issue of, you're sucking in dust and dirt, some of which makes its way through the air filter and is going to end up in your oil. But more importantly, when you're off-road, you're slipping the clutch. And all these bikes have, at least I'm pretty sure all these bikes have wet clutches. Any of the popular ones do. And all that debris from the clutch is going right into your oil. Now, if you're on the street, you're probably not slipping the clutch much, so there's not a whole lot of debris going in there. But regardless of, any other figures that the manufacturer was thinking about for making up an oil change interval, if you're riding a lot off-road and you're slipping your clutch, you should be changing your oil pretty frequently. I would say probably at 1,000 miles on any of these bikes or less. So either the lower number here or 1,000 miles would be my suggestion if you're truly riding these bikes off-road and you're truly riding them on, technical single track where you're slipping the clutch. If you're just doing fire roads, and you're riding the bike similarly to how you would ride on the street anyway, I wouldn't sweat it. But if you're doing true technical riding, I would not be waiting, over 1,000 miles, maybe 2,000 miles, absolute tops, without changing your oil. Just do it early. I mean, how long does it take to change the oil? It's not that bad. Valve check, some pretty big differences there as well. Some of the higher outliers, the WR250R at 26,600, I already addressed that one. DRZ400S at 15,000. These are some pretty high figures. Same thing, CRF 250L at 16,000. I think I'd check any of these that have a figure, over 10,000 at 10,000 anyway. But let's get back to the smaller comparison. So I think these two numbers here are pretty comparable, and I don't know if the manufacturers are considering these as, more dirt-focused numbers. I think they are, especially since this one I'd converted from hours for the KTM. And, Honda is certainly targeting a crowd that is going to spend more time, actually riding this bike off the street. But WR250R, again, I wouldn't actually wait this long. I think I've changed mine at more like 1,500 on average, with a mix of probably 50-50 given some long trips I've taken. And the valve check is also reasonably comparable between these two bikes. Yeah, 1,800 is certainly a bigger number than 1,050, but I'm still going to call them in the same range. Where things really start to look differently is in these next two columns. Honda is saying replace your valves at 20,000 miles. Replace your piston and your piston rings at 20,000 miles. KTM, and again, this is calculated. This is a calculated number, assuming you're traveling about 35 miles for 1 hour of bike operation. But you're under 5,000 miles for replacing your valves, and more importantly, replacing your whole piston and rings. And it's not just the piston and rings. I mean, that's a major overhaul. And I think that's true of either one of these bikes, but you're replacing a ton of bearings. I mean, it is a full overhaul. It's not something that most people are going to want to do on their own bikes. And even if you are, it's a pretty big commitment. You're probably going to set aside a whole weekend for that. For folks that ride a fair amount, this figure is going to come pretty quick. It's possible you might be doing 2 of these a year. More likely I think it's probably once a year, but that's still a lot more maintenance than I want to do. I don't know about you guys, but I've got a family and I've got some other hobbies. I don't want to just eat, sleep, and breathe my bike in the garage. I'm kind of feeling that way now because I just picked up a new one, and of course I'm going to be bolting lots of new Farkles on and tuning this up and tuning that up and probably making some parts here and there, but I don't want to be doing a whole rebuild once or twice a year. That sounds like a lot of work. And it's the same case for, if we look at, let's say, the Beta. I think the Beta would have been another good option, another great bike, 430 RS, comparable. Yeah, the oil change is a bit higher, but, I'd almost say that in reality, the oil change, if you're doing 70 street, 30 dirt on the CRF, the 430 RS or any of the KTMs is in reality is probably more like around 1,000 miles. Valve check is identical to the orange bike. Valve replacement, actually let's just bring it up here. Valve replacement is a bit further out, but they're suggesting doing a full rebuild at 3,000 miles. You know, again, wow, that's it's not just time spent on the bike or time where the bike's sitting at the dealer rather than in your garage. There's a fair amount of expense associated with that too. That's not something that's reflected in the MSRP. I mean, I'm not sure offhand what a new piston and set of rings and bearings and everything else you need for a rebuild costs, but I'm sure it's not $5. Let's see. Let's leave those two up there. What else? The 701 Enduro is another it's actually another outlier from a long maintenance interval perspective. I guess more comparable. Let's take a look at some big bikes. So if we take a look at let's say the 701 Enduro, the 690 Enduro R, the KLR 650. These are all bikes where they're a bike that's designed to do much more street than dirt, and that's reflected in the service intervals. And I think if you're doing mostly street on these bikes, these figures are pretty reasonable. I don't know that I'd go beyond 5,000. Just me personally. I don't put enough miles on my bikes where I'd really get to this anyway, because this would probably be over a year for me. So I would just change it at the 1 year mark anyway. And I think that's actually what the maintenance interval guide said. It was 1 year or 6,200 miles in the case of the 701 Enduro or any of these bikes for that matter. And also it's important to note none of these bikes listed an actual set in stone time to replace the valves or to do a full rebuild on the motor. It's just checks. These motors are well built, and they will also go a really long time if you take care of them. And very reasonable valve checks as well. Yeah, the wet weight difference is pretty humorous here. So the KLR is definitely showing its age. But it's also a pretty cheap bike. But at 432 pounds, it's certainly the ugly duckling from a weight perspective. But yeah, I mean, we talked about the other bikes that I really considered, and I hope that gives you kind of a better idea of why I chose this bike, and why I do still feel that even though the oil changes and valve checks are somewhat comparable to the Austrian bikes, that in the end, really the bigger one is that major engine overhaul. There's a bit of a difference on the valve check as well. I got to think of a way that I want to share this. I don't know if I want to just upload the Excel doc to someplace or whatever. I'm a little bit hesitant. I shouldn't say that. I guess my initial thought was I would hate for someone to take this and represent it as their own work. It took me quite a while to dig up all this information from all of the different owner's manuals and service manuals from all these bikes. And then also check sources on each one too. So all these figures are from either the owner's manual for the bike, the actual manufacturer's service manual, and then for each of them, I also just did a quick Google search and confirmed that matched with what initial reviews that were published for these bikes from any of the big magazines or anything else were, and I did find a couple that looked like they were either a misprint in the review or made me go back and look at the owner's manual again and realize that I misinterpreted it. In fact, the Honda CRF 250L is a perfect example. When I first looked at the chart for this one, I had actually thought the oil changes were also every 600 miles, but in reality that was just the initial oil change, and the interval in actuality is 8,000 miles and 16,000 miles for the valves. So, all right, I will leave this chart up now, and I'll let this video run for another 10 seconds or so. So if you want to pause and find your bike here or take a screenshot, have at it, and check down the description. I will, within the next couple of days, find a way to post this publicly as well. Thanks for watching, guys.